Hello students, in our earlier lecture we discussed about the nature of literature, and this today's lecture will be considered as in continuation of the earlier lecture. One common misunderstanding that is about the nature of literature that needs to be first of all removed. Imaginative literature need not use the images. The poetic language is often said to be permitted to use the imagery. Poetic language is beginning with the simplest figures, and throughout the poetic images it forms the culminating all inclusive meaning. So there are some images, symbols that are taken from the mythological systems, and we know each and every culture or human civilization has their own mythological system, and imagery need not be essentially a fictional statement. There are also images used in poetry. These images do have some kind of meaning, but there are so many good poems which are without images. So there is even poetry of plain statement. There are various types of images that we have seen: tactile, thermal, gestatory. All these types of images needs to be studied further. Under the influence of Hegel, 19th century aestheticians such as Vischer and Hartmann argued that art is the sensuous shining forth of the idea. There is another school that spoke that all arts as pure visibility. Much great literature does not evoke sensuous images. It does so in the form of, say, cladding. The usual terminology that we see when we think about the poem as an organism, this terminology may be somewhat misleading, because there is at least one aspect that stress, and that aspect is unity in variety. So this type of content and form both are useful when we use different senses of them. So it is to the reader to begin with the proper understanding of the modern analysis of this thought. When we come to the other side of the literature, is that of a function of literature. The nature and function of literature must, in any kind of a discourse or lecture, must be correlative, because in nature of literature we have function of literature too. The use of poetry follows from its nature. Every object, class of object is most efficiently and rationally used. It requires a secondary use when its prime function has lapsed. The old spinning wheel becomes an ornament or a specimen in a museum. A square piano, no longer capable of music, is made useful in the desk as a desk. Similarly, the nature of the object follows from its use. An artifact has the structure of the proper performance. There much there is much in any literary work which is unnecessarily its function, though interesting or defensible on other grounds, but such literary work are useful to function in a literary perspective. So, when we think about over the history, are there any change in the nature and function of literature? This question is rather difficult to answer. If one goes back far enough, one can say that one can reach a time when literature, philosophy, and religion exist among the Greeks, Aeschylus, Hesiod, and perhaps would be instances. Plato, who often his often quoted argument with Aristotle and against Aristotle, is that of that these poets are no more useful. So he has banished the poets from his republic based on the function of the poetry. On the whole, a reading of history of aesthetics, poetry leaves one with an impression that the nature and function of literature, and that we can definitely compare and contrast with other human activities. These activities basically have not gone any kind of a change. And the history of aesthetics might be summarized as a kind of a dialectic in which theses and counter theses are Horace's dulcing. Poetry is sweet and useful. See, both adjectives are very much similar, but there may be some kind of say misconception with regard to function of poetry. Poetry is pleasure. Poetry is for instruction, and that all we see. Poetry should be a propaganda. It is answered in view that it should be pure sound, arabesque, and of course it is pleasurable. See, can we use this double criteria as a definition of literature, or is it rather a criteria of a great literature? So we have to go through the good, great, and sub-literary value they appear. There may be some kind of a real doubt. So it is commonly thought that it is a sheer escape and amusement. There are no such a sub-literary readers, not those of readers of good literature. So in answers to our question, what is sweet and what is useful, it is what is to be appropriate, it is all depend on that. So one contemporary line that asserts the use and seriousness of poetry by finding that poetry conveys knowledge. Poetry is a form of knowledge, and Aristotle had seemed to say something like that in his famous dictum that poetry is more philosophical than history, and he proved. See, so the usefulness, seriousness, instructiveness of literature is more pleasurable and more serious in its duty, which must be done, and a lesson should be learned, but there should be an aesthetic seriousness, and that is a seriousness of perception. So, the difficult question that modern poetry can always shrug off is aesthetic judgment. So, another point of importance is that has literature a function or functions? So, giving all these historical so called theorists who propounded their theory with regard to the function of literature, we must understand what the other writers have given. See, if we go through these details, we will come to the long history right from the Plato to the modern era in which this question is relevantly discussed. Suppose Sydney in his defense of an apology, A.C. Bradley that we see. So, these questions are relevantly discussed among the theorists, and this theorist that we see have greatly contributed towards the definition and function of literature. See, if we see the literature and the nature of literature, we will easily understand that it has some aesthetic pleasure. We read literature, we are interested in literature because literature represents life. It appeals to human mind. Life is the origin and basis for, or say raw material for literature. So, life and literature are closely connected to each other, and that is there is an important plus of art and beauty in human life. Human beings have natural affinity for art and beauty. Literature is one of the fine arts. There is beauty and art in literature. We are attracted towards it. Naturally, we are delighted in the art and beauty. Great literature has something universal. It teaches something. It has certain duty to perform to the entire human race. Broadly speaking, the function of literature is threefold: to delight the readers, to teach and instruct, to move, and to transform the readers. So, the first function that we are going to discuss is to delight the readers. This is a major function of literature. Pure literature or literature of power gives us a aesthetic pleasure. Human life is full of sorrow and hardship. The burden of work and responsibilities that we share, that we rest. So, it becomes like a desert, but literature proves an oasis, a brighter picture in the life. Literature takes us away from the dull and tedious life. So, this helps us see to move the readers is also one of the function of the literature. See, as we have seen, to teach and instruct readers, literature gives us a very broad idea about the human lives. And when literature is performing its duty, definitely we have the best quality, such kind of a life and curiosities that are fulfilled. So, literature delights us. At the same time, to instruct the readers, when we see great literature instructs and teaches some moral things to the readers. It gives moral lessons. It gives moral lessons. Our experience of life is enhanced. We begin to think over the characters, over the experiences. We begin to think of the lives that are presented with the life lessons. So, literature is useful to instruct morality. Preaching is not the ultimate purpose of literature, but when we read masterpieces in the fiction like Thomas Hardy, Dostoevsky, and Crime and Punishment, we seem to feel that our command of life, our insight into life are generally enhanced. The moral instructions given by literature are more superior to the instructions given by the moral teacher. Complete awareness of life is possible only through literature, and this is the morality of art and literature. But art cannot be sacrificed on the altar of morality. The power of literature lies in its capacity to move and to teach and to transform the lives of the readers. Great literature is moral in itself. It has a moral influence, and like this, literature helps us. Selfish emotions are removed. And this is the end of literature. To move the readers, this is also one of the function of the literature. The third function that we see, the poetry in general, through the medium of language, words and symbols used by the poet or the literature, are much more effective. They influences very deeply to change the entire capacity with feelings. So poetry deals with imagination, but at the same time inspires our emotions and feelings. We are moved by such a imagination and experiences. Advisors don't just influence, but these teachings by the poetry moves us as a powerful weapon by the poetry. So one great poet can influence lots of people, and in this way literature delights and instructs and moves the reader. There are various theories regarding the function of literature. Literary books are not written just to be thrown away in a waste paper basket. They have the purpose to serve from one age to another, from the ages and ages. They are supposed to do and play a very pivotal role in the literature. Plato attacks the poets banished from his ideal state, but this in the history is not relevant, may not be relevant here. So we just need to think from this, the positive side of the literature. So literature gives us a healthy life. It uses this relevance, and that is what we need. It has a long history. The function of literature has been interpreted. Nature of literature has also been theorized. Poetry, A.C. Bradley has said, poetry for poetry's sake is an important function, but it means that literature has all possible functions. He had something in his mind. So literature gives knowledge, It inspires and sharpens our feelings and imagination. That is what literature has a great role to function, and that is what we just needs to think about the nature of and function of literature. So in this regard, we just need to go through these aspects of literature. So I hope you will enjoy this lecture and will find this much more useful for you. Thank you.